Welcome to The Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Mathews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from the complexity of development to the art of resistance, from colonial histories that haunt us to reimagining futures. Our guest in this episode is Professor Pompa Banerjee, who teaches courses in early modern literature and culture at the University of Colorado, Denver. Her work focuses on the literary and cultural dimensions of Europe's cross-cultural encounters in the global Renaissance, especially in the ways they shape identity in the age of discovery. In this episode, we speak specifically about her book, Burning Women, Widows, Witches, and Early Modern European Travelers in India, published in 2003, and a later article she published in an anthology on Hamlet in 2021. In this fascinating book, she studies the unexpected crossings between European witches and Indian widows through the ritualized violence that connects them, namely the public spectacle and theatre of their burning. In her book, she pours through European travel narratives from 1500 to 1723, where travellers often kept records of their representations of Sati. But in their descriptions, there is an absence, what she terms as a literary haunting, or an erasure of the witch from European depictions of widow burning. We explore this in our conversation, and also speak of how the British in the later colonial period used the narratives of the barbaric practices of brown people to assert their moral right to rule. One reason for this erasure was the way these burnings were coded. While the Sati's burning was coded as a heroic sacrifice, the witches' burning was coded as legitimate retribution for terrible offenses. In these burnings, female bodies become sites of ideological reformation that aim to produce subjected and docile bodies. European travellers used their records to show the Sati as an exemplar of the good wife, with her deathless love for her husband, while the witch symbolized the demonic deviance from the ideal. From this book, we move to the article I alluded to, written in 2021. Here we discuss Shakespeare and a rereading of Hamlet through the movie Haider, set in Kashmir. In the movie, where fire plays a central role, the image of the feared Muslim female suicide bomber is conflated with the non-threatening Hindu self-destructive wife who cannot live without her husband. Our overall discussion was in the context of fire's symbolism and its role in ritualized violence, embodying the socio-political ideologies that mandate proper gender roles for women, complicated through class, caste, and other discriminatory markers. In this ritualized violence, we often find contradictory motives of resurrection, purity, cleansing, punishment, deification, and transcendence. A running theme, of course, being the disciplining of female desire and sexuality. At the beginning of the season, I was keen to explore gendered violence within the context of fire, and we were so fortunate to find Professor Pompa Banerjee, who could lead us so expertly through these literary hauntings, fiery spectacles, and incendiary crossings. Pompa, it is such a pleasure to have you join us at The Subverse. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to get us started off. In your book, Burning Women, which was published in 2003, you follow early modern European travel narratives of Hindu widow burning, which coincided with successive waves of witch hunts in Europe. These travel narratives range from 1500 to 1723. By the 1500s, you note that representations of Sati, observed and recorded by Europeans, were conventional in travelogues of India. You begin your book with the silence that haunts the rest of the book, what you term as a literary haunting, which is the erasure of the witch from European depictions of widow burning. Could you tell us more about this literary haunting and what the premise of this book is?
Well, the book is about what is not there. So throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, European travel narratives of India, they recorded multiple instances of the practice of Sati. So this is where I saw the absence, because many of these Europeans said that they were providing eyewitness accounts of the burning of women in India. And they usually had these vivid illustrations of the burning scenes. And they're from different parts of Europe, written in different languages, but they have a very similar pattern, right? So the violence is imagined as a theater with the fire and the burning body at center stage. There's a funeral pyre, woman burning in heroic self-sacrifice, and she shows no visible signs of pain or physical distress. And much like theater, all the images show multiple people witnessing the scene. And here is what is not there. These eyewitness accounts of Sati appeared at a time when there were ferocious witch hunts in Europe, where women were burned at the stake in huge numbers. And those European burning scenes were recorded in pamphlets, which were translated in several languages, circulated widely. So these Europeans would have read or witnessed or heard about the burning of witches, who are called damnable vermin, by the way. So all of the accounts included vivid images of burning in exactly the same theatrical pattern. The fire, usually stylized, a stake instead of a pyre, a woman burning with no apparent sign of pain because it was thought that the devil made them insensible to pain. And of course, there were multiple witnesses. So I went back to the travel narratives when they discussed other phenomena for which their vocabulary was inadequate. For instance, a mango is like a peach. But when they wrote about Sati, which was completely new to their audiences, not one of them compared it to the burning of witches, which has very familiar ingredients: the stake, flames, a woman, witnesses. It should have been estranged, but uncannily familiar to them. The literary haunting you mentioned consists of the extraordinary similarities between the two scenes. So when travelers write about Sati and they provide many images of the burning scene, the reader finds it completely inexplicable. They're almost describing witch burning in their home regions in Europe, but they don't end up connecting the two scenes. So why didn't they seize this readily available analogy in Europe? You know, mangoes like a peach, the burning of Indian widows is like the burning of European witches.
Was some of this distancing purposeful? Was this done on purpose?
Well, they don't signal their intentionality about this, but it became very common. You didn't go to India unless you had a description of the Sati. The inclusion of the Sati was on purpose, obviously, because it sells books or pamphlets. But they used it very creatively. For instance, you could use the image of the self-voluntary, self-sacrificing widow who's the ultimate good wife, right? Because she cannot live without her husband. Now, although remarrying widows were not burnt, it's a very good example for the good wife in Europe as well, because there was a lot of writing about what a good wife is. Somebody who cannot live without her husband, who has no identity without their husband. So the Sati matched the exemplarity of the perfect wife in Europe. That was one of the ways they repurposed the narrative. It's basically storytelling. It's a narrative. And how you arrange your narrative depends on the purpose. So if you're going to write about wifely conduct in Europe, well, this is perfect then. This example of this culture being so alien, so foreign and pagan to boot, not Christian at all. But even they have this supreme example which we can follow for wives who cannot live without their husbands, right? And theirs is a voluntary action, right? Walking into the fire. Our women are not as courageous as that, but at least they could follow this good example.
Could we speak a little bit more about the theater, the spectacle itself, because you do cover that in the book?
It looks like theater because you place the Sati in India center stage. Here's this woman She is center stage, and it's very much like a spectacle. Foucault writes about punishment, and punishment only becomes legible if there are eyewitnesses, much like theater, right? It's only becomes real when there are people watching the audience, because theater is ephemeral, just as this scene is. So there were eyewitnesses because they have to validate that this thing happened in public for us to see. So other things about theater is that a story is told. All theater consists of some kind of storytelling, a narrative that the audience is invited to participate in or fashion according to the way they want. And that's where intentionality comes in. So once you have the theatricality, it's unforgettable. You have the stage, you have an action on the stage, and the action happens in a preordained order. First the priests come, then there's the blessing, all of that, and everybody cheers. In the case of Sati, there is drums and music. Realistically, that's to drown out the shouting and the pain and the screams, all of that. So the narrative is being refashioned on the stage as a joyous occasion, not one of basically murder by the community. So they're refashioning it. The same thing with witch burning, very similar. In the case, the witch is usually center stage, and it happens with a church or a school, something like that in the background, because it's educational. It's a lesson for other women considered deviant. And deviancy could be almost anything in early modern Europe. A wife who is not obedient, a woman who speaks too much, women who desire other women. So deviancy is constructed several ways. And that had to be burnt out of society. So by the time you're done burning a witch, and of course she feels no pain either, because apparently the devil made her insensible to pain. So the pain is not mentioned at all. Yet the theatricality of it survives. There's eyewitnesses, people watching, people writing about it. And again, there's a script. First, the nobility comes out, the priests and the holy water. It's a pre-written script, very much the way drama emerged in Europe from church rituals.
Here, I'm also kind of fascinated because your writing is, of course, situated during pre-colonial times. But later on, once the colonial project was in place, then Sati became a touchstone. So I'm also curious to hear your views about that. You also refer to Gayatri Spivak's very famous article about whether the subaltern can speak, and that was again about the Sati.
In fact, Spivak's comment about white men saving brown women from brown men is something that informs this book, because it is very much part of the civilizing imperative of empire, right? This is a barbaric people who need to be taught the meaning of civilization, civility. So on the one hand, it establishes the moral superiority of the English, right? And English civilization, or if you want to extend it, European civilization descending from Greece and then Rome, and directly, apparently, inherited by the English, right? Never mind the intervening centuries. And so other than that, they could also talk about the ethical obligation. And this is where Spivak's phrase is important: white men saving brown women from brown men. So it becomes a rescue narrative, not just of one Sati, but all of the women in India to be saved from these ravenous, pagan, violent men.
And that's interesting. So the witches deserved it.
Absolutely. The reason they didn't connect, one of the reasons I think is they're coding it differently. One, in Europe, is the narrative. It's how you write the story, right? Or how you believe the narrative you think you're participating in. For the witches, it's they're evil, they're terrible wives, or bad mothers, or childless women, or a woman with deviant sexuality. I mean, you can put all kinds of labels. So these women, they interfered with the idea of a good society, because they're bad wives. And we also want to remember that this is the time of the Reformation, where both Catholics and Protestants were establishing and enforcing their own ideologies. And another form of burning in Europe, equally prominent, especially in the earlier years, is the burning of heretics, prevalent everywhere in Europe. So part of the Reformation shifts in ideology occurs in the body of women. And both Catholics and Protestants discuss what it means to be a good wife for the good of society. And there's a litany of qualities. Succinct phrase for this is chaste, silent, and obedient, which is very much in the pattern of the Sati. So there's a lot of discussion on both sides, Catholics and Protestants, about a good wife, which is why the Sati narrative plays so well to those audiences, because she's the perfect example of what a good wife must be, right?
So the other question that I have, because you continue to write on this theme, that evolves into this fantastic article that you wrote in 2021 in an anthology on Hamlet. You write about the film Haider, which is an adaptation of Hamlet set in Kashmir. And this is in light of Shakespeare's place as a civilizing force. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that.
So I started out thinking about the way Shakespeare, or the idea of Shakespeare, changed over time in India, right? And I used the essay Haider to think about that shift in particular. Adaptations are a very good way of evaluating the source material. So the main shift you see is the way Shakespeare, or the idea of Shakespeare, is understood. So Shakespeare comes to India with the British colonizers. So Shakespeare, the plays, they're literally instruments of civilization. This is what it means to be human. This is what it means to be civilized. And when you read Shakespeare, you understand that. But very soon, it became the main pedagogical tool. Macaulay, his infamous memo from 1835 that said they were debating whether English or Sanskrit or Arabic should be the medium of instruction in India. So he said a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. So gone was Sanskrit, gone was Arabic, gone was a far more ancient tradition of literature and epics and poetry. The most canonical core of the curriculum is Shakespeare, because that's the only way to be civilized. And Shakespeare tells us how to be human. So Shakespeare was used to bolster the imperial mission of educating colonized British subjects, that is, India. And these colonized subjects, the brown men, then could take over the administrative duties of the English, sort of black skin, white mask, though. They're wearing the white mask of English civilization. So Sati then becomes another lesson plan for this cultural education that the British see as moral superiority of their culture, their values.
Thank you so much. Please tell us about what you covered in this particular article, because it's so fascinating how you speak about the film.
Post-colonial adaptations in particular talk about Shakespeare differently because they use Shakespeare for their own context. So Shakespeare is made to speak. It's not speaking for the Indians, but made to speak for the Indian contingency and for the Indian culture. So in Haider, it's set in Kashmir, which is violently fragmented. It's a space. It's on the Indian side of the border where AFSA, the armed forces, they have a special regulation which suspends all civic rights, freedom of speech, and people are just lifted from their homes, Muslim in particular. This is a Muslim area. And all the men are treated as insurgents, and they're picked up, and even a suspicion will get your home burnt. And so the story follows the Haider figure, the Hamlet figure, Haider, who is returning from university where his mother sent him to avoid the threat of terrorism, being picked up by the Indian Army, or converted to the cause by the so-called militants in the area. And Hyder's uncle is the one orchestrating everything, and he gets his brother killed, Hyder's father, who is now missing, and he's buried in an unmarked grave and so forth. The narrative of insurgency is told through Ghazala, who's the Gertrude figure. In the play Hamlet, Gertrude is famously underwritten. When she appears, her speeches are in service of some kind of wife or mother, usually bad, right? She's a bad wife. She doesn't love her husband enough. She's a bad mother. And there are direct references in Hamlet as well, because it reflects the conflicted idea of the widow in Europe. I mean, should she remarry? Is a remarrying woman bad? Is widow remarriage bad? And I'm talking about Europe. So it's very conflicted. And Hamlet has a lot of statements about why Gertrude is a bad mother. Is it because she remarried? There is no injunction against widow remarriage in Hamlet. That's about the only logical explanation for Hamlet's attitude towards his mother. What did she do wrong? She didn't kill her husband. She just remarried. She wanted a second chance in love, in life. What's wrong with that? So it's not clear. But the situation is further clarified in the player scene, where Hamlet brings actors to enact this tragedy where they say, I kill my husband when I take a second husband to my bed. You're killing your husband all over again. And all this comes from Hamlet. So there's considerable suspicion, or I guess anxiety, about widows remarrying again. But her part is very small. But Ghazala is the main focal point of Hyder. She's the one that runs the plot points. It's full of complications and problems. Her own son is considered an insurgent, and she decides to end it all by going to the graveyard, right? Where all these people are buried, and then she wears the suicide vest, and then she blows herself up. So Muslims do not practice Sati. Ghazala has a Muslim identity. But in the film, visually, and I guess in the narrative sense as well, she emerges, especially in that burning scene where her hand is laced with mehndi. She's like a bride, which is what the European descriptions of the Sati were. She's like the bride. And when she burns herself, there's these huge ceremonial fires, like flames, which convert her to this redemptive image of the Hindu good wife. So Ghazala was a bad wife because she didn't love her husband enough. She loved her husband's brother, and she remarried despite having such a wonderful husband. So that bad wife is turned into, through her burning Sati Mata. In the Hindu widow burning, there are shrines that spring up at the site of the burning of women as good mothers. And when they re-emerge, then they're resurrected in memory as good mothers. So the similarities are extraordinary between the Indian Sati and Ghazala, who is Muslim. And therefore, you have this really feared imagining of the terrorist female suicide bomber, the Muslim terrorist female suicide bomber, violent. And that's retold in a new narrative where she's no longer threatening. She is this obedient Hindu wife. And the audiences, I think, would understand that.
We'll be back after a break. I'd like to speak a little bit more about the theme of our podcast this year, which is fire. And that's actually what drew me to your work, especially the title of your book, Burning Women. So I'd like to speak a little bit more about fire and its symbolism and its application in ritualized violence against women. Why does that keep appearing as a motive? I wanted us to reflect a little bit more about this.
It appears over and over again in various cultures because fire is a natural phenomenon. In some cases, in nature, for instance, it used to be considered good for the ecosystem because after that, when trees were burnt as a result of natural fire, then you had the possibility of new life emerging. So it's a very attractive metaphor to seize that natural phenomenon called fire because it lends itself to the narrative of resurrection, phoenix from the ashes, so to speak, right? So it's irresistible and it's got the lure of immortality. That's why fire is set to purify whatever evil there is. The same narrative in the witch burning. It purifies, it refreshes, and you come back with a new life. You fix the evils of society. In Europe, for instance, with the witches, bad wife, magic, and midwifery, women thought to be poisoning their husbands all the time. Well, how do you fix that? Well, you burn the women. I mean, there are eyewitness accounts of German witch burning where so many women were burnt that one village in Germany had 2 women left, 2 out of the entire population. The plague was hitting them. There was famine. There was war. So how do you fix that? You strike the widow. You take her out with fire. Society is fixed. No more famine, no more war, no more plague.
Film that we haven't talked about is Deepa Mehta's film Fire, which itself led to certain conflagrations. In the movie, the 2 women, Radha and Sita, there is the scene almost at the end of the film where Radha's sari catches on fire. There again, it evokes this punishment that you talked about earlier. But of course, she is able to beat Sita and they're able to escape. They rescue themselves. But I also find that scene very interesting because if you also look at dowry deaths in India, it's again something which you will find around a stove and a kitchen area. And I've often wondered, what role does the hearth play in the history of fire itself? The hearth maybe being the place that started creating the female subject. And I would like your views on that.
Oh, absolutely. Because the hearth is a domestic space, right? And in Catholic and Protestant discussions of what it means to be an ideal woman, women, wives, do not go outside. That's the public sphere is the men's sphere. Chaste, silent, obedient women, they live in the domestic space. But the domestic space also creates a great deal of anxiety about women's power in that space and what sort of deviancies might present themselves. And women were solely in charge of food and drinks around the hearth. Remember, it's the family, it's the fire in the house that provides heat, warmth, cooking fire. They used it for everything. If you visit an Elizabethan home in one of those museums, you see all of those things attached. That's where they bathed. That's really the center. But women seem to have this new agency. They are the ones that prepare the medicine when people are sick. They are the ones that might end up poisoning their husbands because Lord knows what he's being fed. On the one hand, obviously she cannot speak, so she needs to be silent at home, not speaking in public, and she needs to be chaste, seeing no other man outside the home. And anyway, if she's not stepping out, there's no question of her infidelity, right? And obedient. She does what the husband tells her. This is where you begin to see the formulation of the female subjectivity, not subjectivity as such, because it's as perceived by the writers, usually almost always male, writing about what a woman is. And if you kind of compare it, I can give you an analogy from the English stage. Until 1660, there were usually no women on stage. Certainly when Shakespeare was writing, women were not allowed to be on stage. And so young boys acted female roles, right? For instance, Gertrude would have been played by a young boy. So female subjectivity in theater is created by male representations, fantasies. And if you hark back for a second to the Sati, the metaphor of theater you mentioned, it's the male subjectivity, the male viewpoint fashioning the woman. This is what a woman is like, a bad woman or a good woman in this case. And the most telling example is Sati's. They made up all kinds of speeches about Sati speaking to the pyre. So they're creating a narrative of the female mind or what a woman is like, told by male authors. So what is this female subjectivity? Is it what women were feeling, or women as agents of their own destinies? I don't know what it means, basically.
And definitely at the core of it is a disciplining of bodies, their sexuality. That's, of course, a running theme.
That is very much a running theme. If I can go back for a second to the instance you mentioned in the film Fire, where her sari catches fire, but that's a form of deviancy. Two women loving each other rather than stabilizing society or, purifying society with heterosexual marriage relationship out of which children are born. That's the social recipe for a good society, a stable, balanced society. So when her sari catches fire, it should remind us of all of these so-called deviant women punished for being unmarried or not mothers, not producing children in the service of, so-called family values as were established. So it is very much reminiscent of the punishment for deviancy.
When you talked about the symbolism of fire, you talked about resurrection, and that's definitely a theme that plays out. And of course, so does purity and cleansing. And here I also find fire annihilates. So there's also that power, ways in which we've accepted certain things to be, that can destroy all of that.
It can, but in the service of another narrative, which is at that moment more powerful, a narrative that is more dominant at this moment. So it can be repurposed, this fire, or in the film Fire, it's the threat of that fire. See, her sari catches fire, but she doesn't die, which is improbable, but okay, she doesn't die. So that's a positive ending. But the threat of fire, which is important because then you can repurpose that fire for ritualized and violent misogyny. There's this hatred of women established through fire.
It's very interesting that when we were doing some research for our podcast episodes, we came across a very interesting study that was done in the UK. And it was done amongst female prisoners who often resort to arson in the prisons. And that is how they would register their protest.
Oh, wow. Exactly. If you remember, Buddhist monks used to burn themselves alive to protest. Yeah, fire is a visible sign of protest because it also could manifest anger, destruction, and all the stuff that's going on in prison with women prisoners, the abuse, the abusive guards, the sexual exploitation, and all sorts of violence, sometimes women against women in the prison. So how do you express that? And that's a very interesting study. I agree. Arson is yet another form of protest by fire, just as, I guess, suicide bombing is some sort of protest.
I'd like to end maybe by just saying, I think definitely in the context of India, fire plays such a central role, both in terms of our religious and our cultural orderings. Everything from, let's say, a nuptial fire to a funeral fire to all the other things that we discussed today. And here I just wanted to ask you whether you had any parting thoughts on the subject and maybe ways in which we can take some of these knowledges to see how we could use it in our activism, in how we look at media, how we look at theatre. and any other thoughts that you may have.
Well, if you think about the narrative of regeneration, right? Resurrection, immortality, and so forth. For the Hindus, fire is witness. We tend to forget that fire is used as a witness to sacred rituals like marriage ceremonies, funerals. Fire needs to watch what is going on. So fire, in this case, takes the role of the spectators in the theater of punishment. When you're burning a woman, you need spectators to say, yes, this happened, and this is why it happened, and we affirm it. That's why you have spectators. The fire, which is consuming the woman's body, is both the witness and the agent of destruction, and is manipulated by the human eyewitnesses of the burnings. Just as the Sati legend has it, that you take a bad wife that is a widow who might otherwise remarry, or very often it's about economics, right? It's about money, it's about wealth. So once you burn her, you have the return of that wealth to the male successor. So when it's used for destruction, the story can be this agent of destruction is actually not destroying the woman's body. It is purifying it. So fire visibly turns into this invisible symbol. Before that, it's a spirit, and spirit has no body, and therefore is far more pure. So it becomes the symbol, the spirit of the woman through the agency of the fire, becomes like fire itself, capable of both destruction and regeneration. Sort of like a model of the goddess Durga. And the women who, the Sati, that is, after she is burned, she's deified, she's elevated, and shrines are made for her. There's all kinds of things that remember her. And she's powerful only because she's dead, and only because the fire has empowered her with these dual qualities of destruction and benediction. It's irresistible, this narrative. What are the ways to counter it? Activism like yours. The more we understand it, the more we read about it. And most people grow up, even in India, especially the younger generation, with no knowledge of the history, as in Europe or on this side of the pond in the US, with no knowledge of the past. Very sketchy, very thin history of what exactly happened, the history of violence against women, right? I don't know until people are familiar with the history. And history tends to repeat itself always. So unless you learn about it, this sort of silence where you don't refer to a form of culturally sanctioned violence against women in your own culture, Sati in our case, and witch burning in the case of Europe, it's going to be repeated because every time there's a disruption in society, economic woes, famines, wars, floods, you name it, fire, of course, it's women whose bodies become the sites of this kind of dispute, right?
Thank you for also mentioning fire as in wildfire and climate change, because that again is being played out and mediated through women's bodies. It's been an absolute pleasure having you, and I hope that we can collaborate on something together, maybe on Shakespeare.
Oh, I would certainly hope so. This was a delight, and thank you everyone for inviting me and having me speak here.
Thanks to Pompa Banerjee for sharing her thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. So long, and thanks for listening.